The Midnight Bakery, a cozy night shift bedtime story. The rain had started just after 10, a steady winter drizzle that turned the cobblestones dark and slick. By the time I pulled up to the bakery at 11, it had settled into that particular kind of persistence that promised to last until morning. I sat in my car for a moment, watching the water stream down the windshield, blurring the streetlights into soft yellow halos. The village was completely silent. Everyone else was home, tucked into warm beds, drifting into sleep. And here I was, about to begin. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat, pulled my hood up, and made a run for it. The bakery door was old and heavy, painted a deep green that looked almost black in the darkness. My key turned in the lock with a satisfying click, and I pushed inside, shutting the weather out behind me. The silence inside was different from the silence outside. Outside, the world felt empty. Inside, it felt full of potential, of waiting, of the lingering presence of all the bread that had been made here before. The air smelled faintly sweet, a combination of yesterday's loaves and the sourdough starter that lived on the counter. I flipped the light switch, and the old fluorescent bulbs flickered to life, humming softly. I hung my wet coat on the hook by the door and stood there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. The bakery looked exactly as I'd left it 8 hours ago. The wooden work table in the center worn smooth by decades of use. The massive oven against the far wall, its door scarred and blackened. The shelves lined with banneton baskets and linen cloths. The large window that looked out onto the empty street. Everything in its place. Everything ready. I rolled up my sleeves and washed my hands at the deep sink, the water running cold at first, then gradually warming. The pipes groaned gently, a sound I'd come to find comforting. I dried my hands on my apron and turned to face the counter where Fred lived. Fred was my sourdough starter, and he had been alive longer than I'd been working here. The previous baker had passed him down to me with explicit instructions. Feed him every day, keep him at room temperature, and for heaven's sake, don't let him get cold. Fred lived in a large glass jar with a cloth cover held on by a rubber band. Tonight, he was particularly active. Bubbles rose through the thick, creamy mixture, popping at the surface with tiny, indignant sounds. I know, I said softly, unscrewing the lid. You're hungry. Fred had a personality, or at least I'd given him one. He was demanding, temperamental, and absolutely essential. Without him, there would be no bread. He was the living heart of everything I made here. I'd learned to read his moods. When he was happy, he smelled pleasantly tangy, like yogurt and apples. When he was neglected, he developed a sharp acetone edge that made me feel guilty. Tonight, he smelled perfect. I measured out flour and water, combining them in a small bowl before adding them to Fred's jar. The flour was organic, stone ground, the kind that still had flecks of wheat bran in it. It felt slightly coarse between my fingers. The water was room temperature. Fred hated cold water. I stirred the mixture in slowly, using a wooden spoon, watching as the fresh food disappeared into his bubbly mass. There you go, I murmured. That should hold you. Fred's bubbles seemed to settle, becoming slower and more rhythmic. Satisfied, I covered him again and set him back in his spot. He'd work all night, the wild yeasts and bacteria in him consuming the flour and water, creating the carbon dioxide and acids that would leaven tomorrow's bread and give it that distinctive, complex flavor. Fred was my partner in this, my first companion of the night. The rain picked up outside, drumming harder against the windows. I looked at the clock. 11:20. Time to begin. I gathered my ingredients, laying them out on the work table with deliberate care. First, the flour. I hauled a 25-pound bag from the shelf, feeling its weight in my arms, and set it down with a soft thump. The bag was made of thick paper, slightly rough, with the mill's logo printed in faded blue ink. I used a scoop to measure flour into a large mixing bowl, watching as it tumbled out in soft white clouds. Each scoop sent up a little puff of flour dust that caught the light and drifted slowly down. Next, water. I filled a large measuring pitcher from the tap, adjusting the temperature until it ran lukewarm. Too hot would kill the yeast. Too cold would slow everything down. I learned to judge it by feel. It should be the same temperature as the inside of my wrist, like testing a baby's bottle. The water was clear and pure, drawn from the village well. It tasted faintly mineral, which I liked to think added character to the bread. Salt came next. I kept it in a ceramic jar of coarse sea salt that looked like tiny crystals. I measured it carefully. Too much would tighten the gluten too fast and kill the yeast. Too little and the bread would taste flat. I poured it into a small bowl and set it aside. Salt would go in later, after the flour and water had a chance to get acquainted. Finally, I measured out a portion of Fred, scooping the thick, elastic starter into a smaller bowl. He stretched as I scooped him, forming long, glossy strands. This was a good sign. It meant his gluten was well developed, his yeast active and strong. I'd use about 20% of the flour weight in starter, enough to give the bread its distinctive sour flavor and its ability to rise. I poured the water into the large bowl with the flour, then added Fred. Using a wooden spoon, I began to mix. At first it was easy. The spoon moved through the mixture without resistance. But as the flour hydrated, it became harder to stir. The dough grew shaggy and rough, clumping around the spoon, clinging to the sides of the bowl. I switched to my hand, plunging it into the mixture, feeling the cool wetness, the gritty flour, the sticky starter. I squeezed and folded, bringing it all together. After a few minutes, I added the salt, sprinkling it over the surface, and then kneading it in. The salt dissolved quickly, and I could feel the dough change under my hand. It became smoother, more cohesive. The gluten was beginning to form long chains of protein that would trap the gas from the yeast and make the bread rise. When the dough had come together into a rough mass, I turned it out onto the work table. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. This was the part one loved most. The wooden table was cool and smooth under my palms. I'd floured it lightly, just enough to keep the dough from sticking, but not so much that it would dry out. The dough sat there in a lumpy heap, patient and waiting. I pressed my palms into it, feeling its coolness, its slight resistance. Then I began to knead. Push forward with the heels of my hands. Fold the far edge back toward me. Turn the dough a quarter turn. Repeat. Push, fold, turn, push, fold, turn. The rhythm was immediate and hypnotic. My hands found it without thought. Muscle memory built from hundreds of nights just like this one. The dough began to change. With each push, I felt it stretch. With each fold, I felt it strengthen. The gluten strands were aligning, forming a network that would trap air and give the bread its structure. The sound was deeply satisfying. The heavy thump of dough hitting wood, the slight squeak as I pushed forward, the whisper of flour dusting across the table's surface. Outside, the rain continued its own rhythm, a counterpoint to my work. Inside, there was only this: my hands, the dough, the table. Nothing else mattered. I kneaded for 10 minutes, maybe 15. Time became elastic, stretching and compressing. My shoulders warmed with the effort. A light sheen of sweat formed on my forehead. The dough gradually transformed from a rough, sticky mass into something smooth and elastic. I could feel the change in texture. It became silky under my hands, no longer grabbing at my palms, but sliding smoothly. When I pressed into it, it pushed back gently, like something alive. I picked up the dough and stretched a small piece between my fingers, holding it up to the light. It formed a thin, translucent membrane, the window pane test, bakers called it. This meant the gluten was well developed. The dough was ready for its first rest. I shaped it into a rough ball and placed it in a large bowl, covering it with a damp cloth. It would rest here for 30 minutes, giving the gluten time to relax and the yeast time to wake up and begin its work. I washed my hands, scrubbing the dried bits of dough from between my fingers, and checked the clock. Midnight exactly. I walked to the back door and peered through its small window into the alley behind the bakery. The raccoon was back. He was at the dumpster, his small, dexterous hands working at the lock I'd installed last month. His fur was slick with rain, and he was completely focused on his task, manipulating the padlock with surprising precision. I watched him for a moment, impressed, despite myself. He'd been trying to break into that dumpster for weeks now. I had to admire his persistence. I tapped gently on the glass. The raccoon froze, his hand still on the lock, and turned to look at me. His eyes caught the light from the kitchen, reflecting it back in 2 bright points. We stared at each other for a long moment. Then, deliberately, he turned back to the lock and continued working on it. I laughed quietly. Stubborn little guy. There was something oddly companionable about this. Here we both were, working through the night while the rest of the village slept. He had his task. I had mine. We were both determined to see them through. I wondered if he'd ever succeed in opening that lock. Part of me hoped he would, just to see the satisfaction on his little masked face. I left him to his work and returned to the kitchen. The dough had been resting. Time for the next stage. I uncovered the bowl and looked at the dough. It had already begun to change, relaxing and spreading slightly in the bowl. I floured the table again and turned the dough out, feeling its weight in my hands. It was warmer now, heated by the fermentation happening inside it. Millions of yeast cells were consuming the sugars in the flour, producing carbon dioxide and alcohol, transforming this simple mixture into something greater than the sum of its parts. I needed to divide the dough into loaves. I'd make 6 large rounds tonight, enough to fill the morning case and have a few extra for the afternoon. Using a metal bench scraper, I cut the dough into 6 equal portions, weighing each one to make sure they were even. Each piece was about 2 pounds, enough for a substantial loaf. Now came the shaping, and this required a different kind of attention. I took the first portion and began working it with my hands, folding the edges into the center, creating tension on the surface. This tension was crucial. It would help the bread hold its shape as it rose and baked. I worked carefully, methodically, turning the dough as I folded, feeling the resistance build under my palms. When the top was smooth and taut, I flipped it over and used a cupped hand to rotate it against the table. around and around, tightening the surface even more. The dough moved smoothly under my hand, developing a kind of skin. When it felt right, and this was something I knew by feel, not by sight, I set it aside and moved to the next portion. I shaped all 6 loaves this way, working quietly, focusing on the feeling of the dough. Each one was slightly different. One was a little softer, another a little firmer. I adjusted my technique for each, giving them what they needed. By the time I finished, my hands ached pleasantly, and the loaves sat in a neat row on the table, each one perfect in its own way. I'd prepared the banneton baskets earlier, lining them with linen cloths and dusting the cloths heavily with flour. Now I placed each loaf into its basket, seam side up, and covered them with more cloth. They'd proof here for the next few hours, slowly rising as the yeast continued to work. By 4 in the morning, they'd be ready for the oven. With the loaves proofing, I turned my attention to the ovens. I had 2 of them, both massive, both older than I was. They were temperamental and required constant adjustment, but when they were working properly, they produced the best bread I'd ever made. I checked the thermometers, adjusted the gas, and positioned the racks exactly where I wanted them. The ovens began to warm, ticking and groaning as the metal expanded. The kitchen was getting warmer now. The ovens radiated heat. The fermentation process in the dough generated its own warmth, and even Fred on his counter was contributing, his metabolism running hot as he digested his midnight meal. I rolled up my sleeves further and wiped my forehead with the back of my hand. It was 1 in the morning. I had 3 hours before I needed to bake. I made myself a cup of tea. The electric kettle hissed and clicked off. I poured the boiling water over a tea bag in my favorite mug, the one with the chipped handle that I'd been meaning to replace for months but never did. The tea was chamomile, which seemed appropriate for the middle of the night. I added a little honey and stirred, watching the golden sweetness spiral down and disappear. I carried my mug to the old wooden chair by the front window and sat down, curling my hands around the warm ceramic. Outside, the rain had settled into a gentle, steady patter. The streetlights created small pools of yellow light on the wet cobblestones. The village square was empty, the shops dark, the houses silent. Somewhere up the hill, a dog barked once, then stopped. This was my favorite part of the night, this quiet in-between time when the work was temporarily done and I could simply be still. I thought about the people who would eat this bread. I knew most of them, though not in the usual way. I knew Mrs. Brennan would come in at 6:30 and buy 2 baguettes, one for her breakfast and one to freeze. I knew the Hoffmans would send their teenage son in at 7 for a large round loaf, which they'd use for sandwiches throughout the week. I knew old Mr. Chun came in every single morning at 6:15, bought a small roll, and sat on the bench outside to eat it while he watched the sunrise. I knew them by their bread, by their routines, by the small patterns that structured their days. I was part of those patterns, though they probably didn't think about it that way. They came in, bought their bread, and went about their lives. They didn't see the work that happened here in the darkness. They didn't know about Fred or the raccoon or the way my hands cramped after kneading, or the particular satisfaction I felt when a loaf came out of the oven with a perfect crust. And that was okay. That was how it should be. The work I did here mattered precisely because no one saw it. I made the morning easier for everyone. I made sure that when they walked through that door, There would be fresh bread waiting warm, fragrant, nourishing. That was my job, that was my purpose. I thought about the nurse who sometimes came in after her night shift at the hospital. She always looked exhausted, her eyes shadowed, her shoulders tight with stress. She'd buy a loaf, and sometimes she'd just stand there for a moment, holding it, absorbing its warmth. I'd seen her expression soften, seen the tension ease just slightly. That loaf of bread, still warm from the oven, was maybe the first good thing that had happened to her in 12 hours. That mattered. I sipped my tea and watched the rain. The village slept. The bread rose, and I sat here in between, tending to the small but essential work of feeding people. At 4 a.m, I checked the loaves. I gently pressed a fingertip into one of them, and the dough sprang back slowly, leaving a slight indentation. Perfect. They were proofed and ready to bake. I prepared my scoring tools, a lame, which was essentially a razor blade mounted on a handle, and a small bowl of water to rinse it between cuts. Scoring was an art. The cuts I made in the top of each loaf would control how it expanded in the oven, creating the distinctive pattern that made each loaf beautiful and unique. I took the first loaf from its basket, turning it carefully onto a floured peel, a flat wooden paddle used for sliding bread into the oven. The loaf settled onto the peel, its surface smooth and pale. I held the lame at a shallow angle and made 3 quick, decisive cuts across the top, each one about ½ an inch deep. The blade sliced through the dough cleanly, and the cuts opened slightly, revealing the paler interior. I scored all 6 loaves, giving each one a simple pattern, 3 parallel lines. Some bakers got fancy with their scoring, creating intricate designs, but I preferred simplicity. These cuts were functional, not decorative. They allowed the bread to expand without tearing randomly. The ovens were at temperature now, radiating fierce heat. I opened the door of the first oven and slid the peel inside, giving it a quick jerk to release the loaves onto the hot baking stone. I repeated this with the second oven. The loaves sat there for a moment, pale and vulnerable. Then I closed the doors and set my timer. Now came the transformation. Through the oven windows, I could see the loaves begin to change almost immediately. The heat caused the yeast to have one final burst of activity before it died, producing a surge of carbon dioxide that made the loaves expand dramatically. This was called oven spring, and it was magical to watch. The cuts I'd made opened wide, forming ears and ridges. The surface began to color, going from pale cream to light gold. The kitchen filled with the scent of baking bread. It was impossible to describe this smell to someone who'd never experienced it. It was yeasty and warm, with undertones of caramelization and a faint nuttiness from the whole grain flour. It was the smell of home, of comfort, of safety. It was the smell that made people stop on the sidewalk and breathe deeply, that made them smile without quite knowing why. I watched through the window as the crusts darkened, going from gold to deep amber. The Maillard reaction was happening on the surface, the same chemical process that browns meat and toast, creating hundreds of complex flavor compounds. The loaves were singing now. I could hear the faint crackle and pop as the crust formed and hardened. 20 minutes, 25, 30. I knew the timing by instinct, but I also checked by eye. When the crust was the color of a chestnut shell, when the ears were dark and crispy, when the entire bakery smelled like heaven, they were ready. I opened the ovens and slid the peel under the first loaf, lifting it out carefully. It was hot, dangerously hot, and surprisingly light. Most of its weight was now air, trapped in thousands of tiny bubbles throughout its structure. I set it on a wire cooling rack, and immediately it began to sing. The singing of bread is real. As the crust cools and contracts while the interior remains hot and expanded, the crust cracks in thousands of tiny places, creating a sound like gentle static, like distant rain, like whispered conversation. I listened to it as I removed the rest of the loaves, setting each one on its own rack. 6 perfect loaves, all singing together. I checked each one, tapping the bottom to hear the hollow sound that indicated proper baking, examining the color of the crust, looking at how the scoring had opened. Everything was exactly right. It was 5:30 in the morning. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The sky was beginning to lighten. Not quite dawn, but no longer full night. The village would wake soon. I cleaned the kitchen as the loaves cooled, washing bowls and utensils, wiping down the work table, sweeping flour from the floor. Fred got his morning feeding. He'd be fine now until evening. The raccoon had apparently given up on the dumpster. The alley was empty. Everything was in order. At 6 o'clock exactly, I unlocked the front door and flipped the sign from closed to open. The street was still quiet, but there was a different quality to the silence now. It was expectant waiting. People would be waking up, starting their days, thinking about breakfast. I arranged the loaves in the window display, each one still warm, their crusts gleaming in the early light. They looked beautiful, and I felt a surge of pride. This was my work. This was what I'd made with my hands through the long night. While everyone else slept, I didn't have to wait long. At 6:05, I heard footsteps on the cobblestones. The door opened, bells jingling, and the nurse walked in. She was in her scrubs, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she looked absolutely exhausted. Her eyes had that particular hollow look that comes from 12 hours of dealing with emergencies, difficult patients, and impossible choices. Her shoulders were slumped, and she moved with the heavy slowness of someone running on fumes. "Good morning," I said softly. She managed a tired smile. "Morning. Just finished my shift." "Long night?" "You have no idea." She looked at the loaves in the window, and something in her expression shifted. "Is that bread fresh?" "Just came out of the oven 20 minutes ago. Still warm. I'll take one." The big round one. I selected the loaf she'd pointed to and wrapped it carefully in brown paper, folding the ends just so. The loaf was still warm enough that I could feel its heat through the paper. I handed it to her, and she took it with both hands. She stood there for a moment, just holding it. The warmth seeped into her palms. She brought it close to her face and breathed in deeply, closing her eyes. When she opened them again, they looked different, softer, less haunted. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was thick with emotion. "You have no idea how much I needed this. I did know, though. That was exactly why I did this." She paid, tucked the loaf under her arm, and headed for the door. Through the window, I watched her walk across the square. She stopped on the sidewalk, tore off a piece of crust, and ate it right there. Even from inside, I could see her expression change. Her shoulders relaxed, her posture straightened. She chewed slowly, savoring it, and for just a moment she looked at peace. Then she continued on her way, heading home to whatever rest she could grab before her next shift. But she was different now. That loaf of bread, that simple combination of flour, water, salt, and thyme had changed something for her. It had given her a moment of comfort, of warmth, of normalness in what had probably been a very difficult night. I watched until she disappeared around the corner, then turned back to the bakery. The morning light was streaming through the windows now, illuminating the remaining loaves, making their crusts glow golden. Mr. Chung would be here in 10 minutes for his roll. After him would come Mrs. Brennan, then the Hoffmans, then the steady stream of morning customers who relied on this place, on this bread, on the work I did while they slept. I thought about the hours I'd just spent, the kneading, the shaping, the waiting, the watching. I thought about Fred bubbling contentedly on his counter. I thought about the raccoon still trying to solve his puzzle. I thought about the rain and the darkness and the quiet. No one had seen any of it. No one knew the care that went into each loaf, the attention to temperature and timing, the way I listened to the dough to know what it needed. They didn't need to know. The bread itself was enough, the way it tasted, the way it smelled, the way it made them feel when they held it warm in their hands. The most important work often happens when no one is watching. It happens in the quiet hours and the darkness when the world sleeps and dreams. It happens in bakeries and hospitals, in fire stations and dispatch centers, in all the places where people work through the night to make sure that morning comes with bread and safety and light. I thought about all the invisible work that keeps the world turning. The people who clean office buildings at midnight, who plow roads during snowstorms, who monitor power grids and water systems, and 1,000 other essential services that no one thinks about until they fail. We were all connected, all working in the darkness, all contributing to the fabric of daily life. And that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The door opened again, and Mr. Chun shuffled in, right on time. "Good morning," he said cheerfully. "Smells wonderful in here today." "Every day," I replied, smiling. Every single day, I reached for his roll, still warm from the oven, and wrapped it carefully. Outside, the sun was rising over the village, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The day was beginning. The bread was ready, and I had done my part to make the morning a little bit easier, a little bit warmer, a little bit better. That was my work. That was my purpose. And standing there in my bakery, watching Mr. Chun's face light up as he accepted his warm roll, I felt a deep and quiet satisfaction settle into my bones. This was exactly where I was meant to be. If this story resonated with you, please consider showing your support with a like and subscribe to Deep Sleep Stories Hub for more quiet nights and restful journeys.